Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I guess one thing that the theater and the media ostensibly have in common is you're always supposed to be looking for the other side, think how the other side of the story sees things. As director of the Media Standards Project, I don't have a lot of influence actually over media or standards, but I will share some observations and some experiences from some of the people that I talk to and speak with, some of whom are here today. Last October, the University of Virginia's Miller Center held a series of events here in DC on immigration, and it kind of culminated with a roundtable about how the media writes about immigration and specifically immigration reform. It was moderated by Ray Suarez and had a panel of 4 prominent journalists, and it's actually a very excellent event. A video of it is online on the Miller Center's website. Sorry to plug another center here at the beginning, but the panelists went through and they sort of talked the audience through the stories that they write and how they approach the issue. And they gave a pretty fair representation of the kind of stories that we would expect to see on any given day. There's an emphasis on the changing racial and ethnic makeup of the country, its impact on elections, the Hispanic vote, the border, a lot of emphasis on legalization, with a smattering of stories about the hypocrisy of elected officials thrown in. And 2 of the panelists said that they specifically like to write about immigration as a civil rights movement. One of them said they also like to write about where the resistance to that movement is coming from. And I don't know many people who are lining up to be represented as the face of that resistance within that particular narrative, but presumably some of that resistance comes from the kinds of people that I speak with from around the country whose primary concern with immigration is the levels of immigration and how the numbers impact other issues that they care about. And they're frustrated. They know that there's not a lot of room for them or their perspectives or their concerns in the media's typical approach to writing about or speaking about this issue. And they're teachers, students, veterans, programmers, drywallers, home inspectors. Some of them grew up working on farms. Some of them have lived in cities their whole life. They're the kinds of people who get presidential awards for volunteerism or the Carnegie Hero Award for putting themselves at risk to help others. Their interests are as diverse as their backgrounds, but what brings them all together is that immigration impacts them or the things that they care about in some way. And they're hungry for the kind of reporting that Bonnie Erbé does, the kind of reporting that's willing to connect the dots between immigration policy and other big issues of the day. I started speaking with these people around 2008, around the time that Barack Obama was elected president, and frankly, I thought that we'd be seeing a lot more of this kind of reporting. Bonnie Erbé's immigration special on how immigration impacts healthcare and poverty and natural resources. Along with immigration, these were all top issues for Obama. He certainly, at least on the stump, they were all highlighted in his second inaugural address. And they've all been big news stories, but they're presented more often than not like food on a picky eater's plate. They're always separate. They're rarely allowed to touch. And this drives the people that I talk to crazy. As Bonnie Erbé's reporting demonstrates, we have big decisions to make on some of these issues in front of us, and we ought to get as complete a picture as possible, from resource depletion to poverty to the fraying social safety net. Immigration isn't the only factor in these things, or even the primary factor, but it is often a significant factor, and it's the level of immigration that makes it significant. As the character Lester Freeman says on HBO's The Wire, all the pieces matter. One Numbers USA member that I speak with off and on over the years is a former engineer from the Bureau of Reclamation. And not long ago, he came across a story that he admired on population growth that had a few environmental twists to it. And he reached out to the reporter to compliment him on his story and to pitch the idea of including the immigration angle in future stories. And to his delight, the reporter was not only familiar with the statistics and resources that this former engineer was giving him, but he had a few of his own, and they had a back and forth. And at the end of the discussion, the reporter said, I can't write about that. That's an immigration story, and that's not my beat. Well, what happens when immigration is off limits to reporters who cover other issues, and when immigration reporters are tasked with or choose to cover immigration primarily as a social issue? What happens is we don't get the information. We're not getting the information that we need in order to make fully informed decisions on the other issues that we care about. Towards the end of the Miller Center's roundtable, this came up during the Q&A when a reporter from the audience asked a question about a Rasmussen survey. And the survey found that only 10% of Americans could correctly guess the annual level of immigration, just 10%. To what extent, he asked the panel, should we regard that as a failure of our profession and not informing Americans about this most basic fact about immigration? There was a brief silence. One of the panelists looked down the table at the others and said, "Who wants to take that?" There was a muffled chuckle. There was another brief silence. Then a second panelist said, I still don't understand the question, I'm sorry. So the reporter is Neil Monroe of the Daily Caller. He explained a little bit more about the survey. It was a Rasmussen survey, and it asked approximately how many immigrants legally enter the United States each year. And it was multiple choice: 100,000, 250,000, 500,000, 1 million, 2.5 million, 5 million, more than 5 million, or not sure. 51% said not sure. The next highest percentage, 32%, incorrectly guessed 250,000 or less, which is more or less our historical traditional average. Only 10% correctly guessed 1 million per year, and 7% guessed 2.5 million or more. He repeated his question, and the second panelist said, "There's a lot of ignorance about a lot of things in this world. People don't read. They don't educate themselves. I'm not sure that's our fault." Mr. Suarez, who did a terrific job moderating, he followed up on the question, and he said, we're talking about the numbers, he said, but what about them? Couldn't we include that in the stories we write for context, he asked. And when the panel again hesitated to answer, he himself spoke directly to Mr. Monroe, and he said, I'll take your point that it's a pretty basic thing, and that if we're going to have a national argument about this, we ought to know the size of the problem. Well, it's that pretty basic thing that the people that I talk to are concerned with and that they don't see in the stories that they find. And not just the annual numbers, but how they compound over time. 1 million per year may not seem like much to some people in a country of more than 300 million, but it's the primary driver of population growth in my lifetime. And without changes, we'll be heading beyond 600 million in possibly my children's lifetime. And we can debate about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing or a mix of both, but there's no question that by requiring it, Congress is making profound choices both for us and for generations to come. We ought to talk about it. Mr. Suarez indicated that journalists do talk about it and do tell people about it, and perhaps he was thinking of your reporting. But generally speaking, I respectfully disagree. The second great wave of immigration, larger than the first, has been underway for decades. Most people don't know it, although they may feel it. On top of that, on top of this record level of immigration, the Senate last year introduced, debated, and passed a bill that calls for the largest immigration increase in U.S. history and world history, and almost nothing was written or said about that in the mainstream media, that aspect of the bill. It's not just a question of being underreported, it's barely on the radar. Now, of course, there are exceptions. We're honoring a notable exception today, and there's a few others. I'll give a few examples. The Hill wrote a couple of stories, one on the second great wave, one on the unpopularity of guest worker increases. Slate did a story on the second great wave. The Associated Press did a terrifically thorough story on the immigration increases as laid out in the Senate bill, as did the Washington Post. But I'll add that with the exception of the Post story, all of those stories were written after the Senate had voted. This reminds me of a guy that I spoke with. He used to live near the meatpacking plants outside of Omaha. And he contacted a reporter who was writing about the House versions of comprehensive immigration reform. And he was trying to raise some awareness with this reporter about the immigration increases in the bill. And he got a very nice email back. And the reporter explained that his job was really to let people know that these bills were coming, but not to worry. He was sure that he'd probably get to break the whole issue down once the bill had been debated and passed. Another activist spoke with a reporter who covered the Senate debate, and again, this was after the debate was over, and This reporter had looked at some numbers that the Census Bureau had put out and acknowledged during the course of their exchange that during the entirety of the Senate debate, he had had no idea how much immigration had already increased over the past 40 years. Recently, President Obama declared that the policy debate is over on immigration. But with respect to the debate about numerical limits, it really never began. The Gang of Eight didn't want to talk about it, and we certainly didn't see, and we still don't see, stories that tell us something about the numerical impact of the bill, or the numerical goals or limiting principles of the principal actors involved in the debate. Instead, what we see are stories that are built on a pro versus no narrative, in which people are squeezed into one of two columns. You're either pro-immigration or you're anti-immigration. Well, one of the Numbers USA members that I've spoken with for several years now is a woman. She grew up in poverty. She started working as a young teenager to help pay the bills. She worked 2 jobs to help pay for college. She had to drop out after 2 years with a GPA over 3.8 in order to take her first job in IT to help square away the family's finances. Despite dropping out of school, she prospered. And in fact, she was hired by the FBI in 1967 as a programmer, the only one in her initial group who did not have a degree. And she ended up spending more than 3 decades in the field. Work, she says, was her salvation. Well, she spent much of last summer reaching out to reporters, trying to raise questions that she thought were pertinent and important to the debate. Questions like, how do politicians like Senator Rubio square their belief that people who come from poverty, people like her, should be able to work their way out of poverty, while at the same time calling for a doubling of permanent job seekers through immigration? By the end of the summer, she was no longer asking questions like that. She was just asking why the immigration increases in the bill weren't being covered at all. And her appeals went unanswered. But once, when she provided a little more information about herself, she described herself as an old-line environmentalist, she quickly got a response back from the reporter, who thanked her for her email and, without addressing any of her questions, remarked that he rarely heard from the anti-immigration left. But this is the pro-immigration versus anti-immigration framework that is so often employed in the stories that we read today, and it doesn't accurately describe her or politicians or activists or the American people. I think if you took all of the polling over the past couple of years, including the very few polls that actually asked about limits or numbers, what you would find is that the American people generally have good feelings about immigration and like immigration, and they generally think that immigration should be limited. And what they want is continued, limited immigration. The fundamental disagreement, really the core of the debate, is over those limits and what enforcement should be in place to make sure that those limits have credibility. But the media's common approach to writing about immigration has divorced immigration from this core question, and it's replaced it with this kind of pro versus no narrative. Well, this IT worker, she supported the 1986 amnesty bill. She thought legalization for enforcement was a fair trade-off. She's just still waiting for the enforcement. In the meantime, she has seen immigration more than triple since the days when she was a young person with limited advantages, fighting to get a hold on that economic ladder. And she holds nuanced, complicated views on immigration, born of experience. She's also married to an immigrant from the UK. But in this pro versus no framework, she's just anti-immigration. And that's the end of the story. A couple years ago, she actually sent me a story from an organization called Remapping Debate that does original reporting, and according to their website, they try to ask the why and the why not questions that the mainstream media frequently does not. And they did an interesting story. They spoke with 3 advocacy groups that were pushing for another large-scale legalization and an expansion of the current immigration system. And what they found, what Remapping Debate found, was that none of those groups were willing to set forth any concrete limitations on immigration now or in the future. The reporter wrote, "I was not able to discern any specific limitations that any of the advocates was prepared to affirm. To the contrary, the key arguments for opposing enforcement today appear to be fully applicable to a post-legalization world. Each advocate seemed to be describing a system whereby enforcement would almost always give way to personal or familial factors." That's a perspective that would have been important to understand during this last debate. There was another story a few months ago about a poll sponsored by several pro-Senate bill groups, including Bloomberg's Partnership for a New American Economy. And the story took a sort of typical pro versus no approach, the gist of which was this poll finds support for immigration reform, therefore Republicans who oppose immigration reform will suffer, at least politically. And like many polls, this poll found support for something called immigration reform by describing a version of immigration reform that differed significantly from the immigration reform actually being considered by Congress, particularly when it came to the legalization process. This is a point that was also overlooked by the story, but the Numbers USA member who came across it wasn't so much concerned with that as he was with the fact that neither the poll nor the story made any mention of the legal immigration side of the bill. So he reached out. The reporter didn't have time to talk on the phone. Would you please send an email? Sure, no problem. The activist sent an email, introduced himself, a two-time supporter of President Obama, who strongly disagrees with him on this issue, feels it undermines some of the other issues that he agrees with him on. And he expressed concern that while all the media's attention is focused on the legalization aspect, the arguably more important aspect of doubling immigration to an average of about 2.2 million per year by his estimation over the next decade, including an increase in guest workers as well, was going unnoticed. And he pointed to some numbers that prompted the Congressional Budget Office to predict a small rise in unemployment and drop in wages over the next 10 years should the bill be passed. And he asked, why do we have this blind spot in our coverage? And the reporter who had requested the email replied, "Thank you for reading and sending your thoughts." So it's been nearly a year since the Senate passed the bill, and we still rarely see the immigration increases that it calls for mentioned in the press. What we do see are phrases like, the bill would revamp the legal system, or I've even seen at least one story that said the bill would improve the legal system, but without giving readers any idea of what that meant. Well, Paul Ryan argues that we should increase low-skilled immigration, otherwise industry will have to choose between raising wages to attract American workers or possibly moving their industries overseas, and he fears that the industries will choose the latter. Alan Greenspan argues we should increase high-skilled workers in order to reduce inequality by depressing the wages of engineers and programmers. These are arguments of leading voices, but in order to fully understand their implications, we have to know what kind of numbers they're talking about. And unfortunately, I don't have a good story or anecdote to give any insight as to why the Senate bill has come and gone and the debate continues without the mainstream media acknowledging the immigration increases. But the fact is I've heard stories from people around the country who have asked reporters about this, and mainly the response they've gotten is the same that Neil Monroe got at that Miller Center roundtable: silence. On that roundtable, some of the panelists expressed some surprise at the opposition to the Senate bill. As one of them put it, it seemed to come out of nowhere. And I'm not surprised that they're surprised. Arguably, the opposition to the bill could be boiled down to two of its most unpopular and underreported features. An increase in immigration that would add approximately 30 million permanent job seekers over the next decade, in addition to doubling guest workers as well. Many of them poor, all of them adding to the demand on our infrastructure and natural resources, just as any of us do. And two, a legalization before enforcement sequence that left many people concerned that the bill would not produce the enforcement of numerical limits in the future, even expanded limits. Mr. Suarez spoke about the pressure that reporters feel to make things simple. And he referred to letters that he receives from around the country, letters that say, "What part of illegal don't you understand?" And when my grandparents came, they did it the right way. And we see the same kind of arguments online, comments on news stories all the time. And I think I understand where those comments come from, but I think they're also part of a misguided pro versus no narrative. In this sense, it's the illegal good, illegal bad, legal good, and there's no question of in between or of numbers or limits. And they are oversimplistic. As Mr. Suarez said, it's more complicated than that. One of the complicating factors is the question of limits, that pretty basic thing. It's a key piece to our immigration comprehension, and reporters needn't agree with immigration reductionists to consider it in their stories. Whether the clock runs out on the Gang of Eight bill or not, This is not going to be the last time that we debate immigration as a country. And if we get more reporting like Bonnie Erbé's, I think we'll be laying the groundwork for a more comprehensive understanding of how immigration affects our lives, and perhaps a more comprehensive, maybe even a more civil debate next time around. Amen. Thank you.